"Good morning, miss," said Mr. Montague Egg, commercial traveller, removing his trilby with a flourish as the front door opened. "Here I am again, you see. Not forgotten me, have you? Because I couldn't forget a young lady like you. How's his lordship today? Think you'd be willing to see me?" He smiled pleasantly. The parlour-maid, however, seemed nervous. I don't... Oh, yes, come in, please. His lordship? Well, I'm afraid... Mr. Egg stepped in promptly, sample case in hand, and found himself confronted by a policeman who demanded his name and business. "A travelling representative of Plummet and Rose, Wines and Spirits, Piccadilly," said Mr. Egg. "Here's my card." "Plummet and Rose," said the policeman. "Just sit down a moment, will you? The inspector will want to have a word with you." Somewhat astonished, Mr. Egg took a seat, and in a few minutes' time was ushered into a sitting-room occupied by a police inspector and another policeman with a notebook. "Ah," said the inspector. "Take a seat, Mr. Egg. Perhaps you can give us a little light on this affair. Do you know anything about a case of port that was sold to Lord Borrowdale last spring?" "Certainly, if you mean the Dow 1908. I made the sale myself. I just called to ask his lordship how he liked it, and if he'd care to place a further order." "That seems all right," said the inspector. "Well, Mr. Egg, Lord Borrowdale was found dead in his study this morning. The circumstances suggest he's having taken poison, and it looks as if the poison was given to him in a glass of port." "Don't say," said Mr. Egg. "I'm sorry to hear that. It's not the sort of publicity we care for. What makes you think it was the port?" The inspector pushed a decanter across the table. "See what you think yourself, and here's a glass if you want one, but I shouldn't advise you to swallow anything." Mr. Egg sniffed at the decanter and frowned. He poured out a thimbleful of the wine, sniffed, and frowned again. Then he put a drop on his tongue and spat it out delicately into a flower-pot. Oh, dear," he said. "Tastes as though the old gentleman had dropped his cigar-ash into it." "You're not far out. The doctor says it looks like nicotine poisoning. Now, here's the problem. Lord Borrowdale used to drink a couple of glasses of port every night after dinner. Last night, the wine was taken in, as usual, at 9. It was a new bottle, and Craven, the butler, brought it up from the cellar in one of those basket things. James, the footman, followed him. Lord Borrowdale inspected the bottle. Craven, the butler, drew the cork and decanted the wine. Then they both retired to the kitchen and heard Lord Borrowdale lock the study door after them. He was writing his memoirs, it seems. He was a famous judge, you know, and some of the papers he was using were confidential. Well, this morning the study door was still locked, and when it was broken open they found him lying dead on the floor. The doctor says he must have died at about 10 o'clock. "Suicide?" suggested Mr. Egg. "He had no worries, and his health was excellent," said the inspector. "But how was it he didn't notice the bad taste of the wine?" "Oh, he seems to have been smoking a cigar," said the inspector, "and he was suffering from a cold, so his taste and smell may have been dulled. There are no fingerprints on the decanter or the glass except his own and those of the butler and the footman, and the windows were fastened on the inside." "And the decanter?" asked Mr. Egg. "Was it clean?" "James washed it before he went to the study. The cook saw him do it. The glass was wiped by James when he put it on the tray, and then the whole thing was carried to the study, though James the footman recollects that in the hall a Miss Wainfleet spoke to him for a moment." "Oh, Miss Wainfleet? That's the niece, isn't it? I saw her on my last visit. A very charming young lady," said Mr. Egg. "Lord Borrowdale's heiress," remarked the inspector. "A very nice young lady," said Mr. Egg. "The seal on the cork now. Lord Borrowdale saw it?" "Yes. Here's what's left of it." The inspector produced an ashtray with a few fragments of sealing wax and some cigar ash. Mr. Egg inspected them. "That's ours, all right," he pronounced. "How about the strainer?" "Washed out that afternoon in boiling water by the kitchen maid. Taken out with the bottle and washed again at once, unfortunately. It might have told us something about when the nicotine got into the port wine." "Well," said Mr. Egg, "it didn't get in at our place. Where is the bottle, by the way?" "Packed up to go to the analyst," said the inspector, "but you can have a look at it. Podgers, let's have that bottle again." The constable produced the port bottle, its mouth plugged with a clean cork. Mr. Egg removed the cork and took a sniff at the contents. His face changed. "Where did you get this bottle from?" he demanded. "From Craven, the butler. He took us along to the cellar himself. It was standing on the cellar floor at the end of a row of empties. He said he put them on the floor till the time came for them to be taken away." Mr. Egg tilted the bottle. A few drops of thick red liquid escaped into his wine-glass. He smelt and tasted them again. "No nicotine there," said Mr. Egg. "No, you'll have to send it to be analysed, but you'll find that bottle innocent." "So we concentrate on the decanter," said the inspector. "Just so. Do you happen to know how many of the bottles had been used?" said Mr. Egg. "Well, Craven can tell us. Why?" "Just to be sure that this is the right bottle," said Mr. Egg. "I shouldn't like to feel I've misled you in any way." The inspector rang the bell, and the butler appeared, an elderly man of respectable appearance. "Craven," said the inspector, "Mr. Egg is interested in the history of the port wine." "This bottle," said Mr. Egg, "it's the one you opened last night?" "Yes, sir." "How many have you got left?" asked Mr. Egg. "I couldn't say, sir, without the cellar book." "And that's in the cellar, eh? I'd like to have a look at your cellars. I'm told they're very fine." "Yes, we'll all go and look at the cellar," said the inspector, and Craven bowed and led the way, pausing only to fetch the keys from his pantry. "This nicotine now," asked Mr. Egg as they proceeded down a long corridor, "is it very deadly?" "I understand from the doctor," replied the inspector, "that a few drops of the pure extract would produce death in anything from 20 minutes to 7 or 8 hours. "And how much of the port had his lordship taken?" said Mr. Egg. 2 glasses?" "Yes, sir," said Craven, "to judge by the decanter." "And tell me," said Mr. Egg, "is there a pond or stream in the garden, Mr. Craven? You see, somebody must have brought the nicotine in something, you know. What would they do afterwards with the bottle, or whatever it was?" "Throw it among the bushes, or bury it," said Craven. "Ah, stupid of me," confessed Mr. Egg. "Ah, this is the cellar, is it? Splendid. A real slap-up outfit, I call this." They went in. "Here is where the Dow 1908 stood, sir," said Craven. "Number 17 bin. 1, 2, 3½ dozen remaining, sir." Mr. Egg nodded. "Yes," he said, "here are the Dow 1908. Sad to think his lordship will never enjoy them. 3½ dozen. A fine old gentleman, Lord Borrowdale, though something of a tough nut." "He was hard, sir," agreed Craven, "but just. A very just master." "Quite. And these, I take it, are the empties. 12, 24, 20, 29, and 1 is 30, and 3½ dozen is 42, 72, 6 dozen. Good." He lifted the empty bottles one by one. "They say dead men tell no tales, but they talk to me. This one, for instance. If this ever held our Dow 08, you can take me out and scramble me. Wrong smell, and that splash of whitewash was never put on by us. Easy to mix up one empty bottle with another. 12, 24, and 28, and 1 is 29. I wonder what's become of the 30th bottle." "I never took one away," said Craven. "Just a moment," interrupted the inspector. "Do you say that bottle doesn't belong to the same bunch of port wine?" "No, but no doubt Lord Borrowdale sometimes went in for a change of vintage." Mr. Egg inverted the bottle and shook it. "Quite dry. Curious. Now that other bottle, the one you said was opened last night, Craven, how did you come to make a mistake like that? If my nose is to be trusted, that bottle had been open a week, at least." "Somebody must have changed it round," said Craven. "I think," the inspector put in, "we'll get this cellar properly examined. Now, if you'll just step upstairs with me, Mr. Egg, I'd like a word with you." They returned to the upper air. "I don't know if you realise, Mr. Egg," observed the inspector, "the inference of what you said just now. Supposing you're right about this bottle not being the right one, somebody's changed it on purpose and the right one's missing. And what's more, the person that changed the bottle left no fingerprints behind him, or her." "Yes," said Mr. Egg, "and it looks as if the poison had been in the bottle after all, doesn't it? And that, you're going to say, is a serious lookout for our firm, seeing our seal was on the bottle when it was brought into Lord Borrowdale's room. And, Mr. Egg, said the inspector, smiling, since nobody but you had any interest in changing that bottle over, I ought to clap the handcuffs on you. Now, that's a disagreeable inference, protested Mr. Egg, and I hope you won't follow it up. Don't you think that before we do anything else, it would be a good idea to have a look in the furnace room? The furnace room? It's a place that Craven particularly didn't mention when we were asking where anybody might have got rid of something. The inspector agreed, and with the help of a couple of constables, the ashes of the furnace that supplied the central heating were raked over. The first find was a mass of semi-molten glass, which might once have been part of a bottle. Well, you might be right, said the inspector. Well, we're not likely to get any nicotine out of this. From the ashes he picked out a thin piece of twisted metal to which a lump of charred bone still clung. What on earth's that? Said the inspector. It doesn't look like much, but I think it might once have been a corkscrew, said Mr. Egg. And if you'll look here, you'll see that the metal part of it is hollow. And I shouldn't be surprised if the thick bone handle was hollow too. Badly charred, of course, but if you were to split it open and found a hollow inside and possibly a little melted rubber, that might explain a lot. Mr. Egg, exclaimed the inspector, I think I see what you're getting at. If this corkscrew had been made hollow and contained a rubber reservoir inside like a fountain pen filled with poison, the poison might be made to flow down the hollow shaft of the corkscrew and into the Borrowdale's port by pressure on some sort of plunger arrangement. That's it, said Mr. Egg. And look, there's even a little hole in the metal at the tip of the actual screw. But who? The man who drew the cork, said Mr. Egg. The man whose fingerprints were on the bottle. Craven? The butler? But where's his motive? Lord Borrowdale was a judge, said Mr. Egg, and a hard judge too. If you were to have Craven's fingerprints sent up to Scotland Yard, they might recognise them. I don't know, it's possible. Or Craven might be mentioned in Lord Borrowdale's memoirs that he was writing. Neither Scotland Yard nor Miss Wainfleet, the niece, had anything to say against the butler, but the records of Lord Borrowdale's judicial career showed that many years before he had inflicted a savage sentence of penal servitude on a young man named Craven, who was by trade a skilled metal worker and involved in a fraud upon his employer. Further investigation showed that this young man had been released from prison 6 months ago. He was Craven's son, of course, said the inspector, and he had the skill to make a corkscrew just like the one used in the household. Wonder where they got the nicotine from. Well, we shall soon be able to check that. But when did you begin to get interested in Craven, Mr. Egg? Oh, I was interested in Craven a long time ago. You see, the first time I called here, he addressed me as young fellow, and said tradesmen should go round to the back door. We have a saying in the trade, whether you're wrong or whether you're right, it's always better to be polite. I simply felt that, as a butler, Craven wasn't quite right. And it was true, wasn't it? Very true, said the inspector. Very true indeed.